of you have probably known me long enough, or heard me preach enough, or been in enough discussions with me to know that I happen to love Pentecost. There's not a lot not to love with the rushing winds and the blazing fires and the divine doves and all the married voices. And for me, from a personal standpoint, God as Spirit sort of jives with my own experience and understanding of God. Because for whatever reason, I can encounter God more easily as Spirit than as ubiquitous Father or crucified and raised divine human. Spirit makes sense to me. The tangibility of doves, wind, and fire expresses the unconfined and unrestrained, yet real, tangible presence of God. So I've always gravitated towards that extraordinary moment 2,000 years ago. And we today have the vantage point of looking back at that event and imagining how very miraculous it was. However, the truth of the matter is that whatever the disciples were expecting when Jesus told them that the Spirit was coming, the rushing winds and the fire, was not at all what they had in mind. Especially during something as common and routine as Pentecost. That's right, Pentecost was common and routine. We have in the Christian church narrowed Pentecost down to this miraculous occurrence when Jesus fulfilled the promise of sending the Advocate. And that did happen. But Pentecost was already a designated festival day which celebrated the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Each year, 50 days after Passover, the Jews remembered the gift of the law and gave an offering to God in proportion to the amount that they had been blessed in the last year. So it's a little bit like Stewardship Sunday, only with a lot more pomp and celebration, and honestly, with a bit more serious thought to how very, very much they had been graced. Anyway, they knew what to do with Pentecost, like we do. You wear red, and you light candles, you talk about wind and fire and utopic translation. Pentecost was very predictable. If you came here this morning expecting everything to be adorned in purple, that would have been a surprise. However, it was predictable, except for 2 times. When the law was given on the top of the mountain, it was accompanied by thunder and lightning and cloud and earthquake. Which, if that was happening and you were on the mountain, you would sit up and take notice, or you would run for shelter. That would not have been predictable. And then there's this time, with the wind and the fire and the chaos. And so the only reasonable explanation was alcohol, which is amusing to me. Not the accusation that they were drunk at 9 in the morning, but that God actually stirring things up. That's not even a reasonable explanation. They prefer the explanation of alcohol. Something amazing happens, and whether God is involved in it is up for debate. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, because that sounds all too familiar. I want God to be big and mighty and move with determination, but I wonder if we'd believe it anyway if he did. But the other odd truth here is that at this festival, during which the people are giving thanks to God, they expect nothing much to happen. They have been doing this festival thing for quite some years now. They've got the service down pat. Nothing much is going to happen. At least nothing different than happened last year on Pentecost. So I guess that's where I got stuck this week, realizing that nothing much can be of God too. Because we may really only recognize one miraculous Pentecost here in the Christian church, but it has been happening for years and years and years. And dare I say that Pentecost isn't even just a day a year. Pentecost was and always has been an oxymoron. It is simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. There's Pentecost on top of a mountain and alighted atop a believer's head. There's Pentecost in a pillar of fire and fire in the soul. There was Pentecost law written on a tablet, and it's also good news written on the heart. And Pentecost was the dove that brought the olive branch to indicate safe harbor. And Pentecost is also the spirit dove that sends us forth into uncharted territories. In small, unseen ways and in big, breathtaking ways, the spirit rushing and soaring and creeping and gathering, sighing and igniting has been going on since the beginning of creation. And so this week I realized, for as much as I love the celebration of this day and the rush of it all, we have clipped the Spirit's wings by expecting too much of Pentecost. Now, I'm not a vet or a bird owner, but from what I understand, there's some controversy over whether or not a pet bird should have its wings clipped. Regardless of opinion on this, the basic reason for clipping wings is to do it for the bird's own safety. Because it's too dangerous to let a bird fly. Yep. It's too dangerous to let a bird fly. It's too risky for that which has been given wings, for that which has been given the ability by God to harness wind and use it for good, to fly. The bird might hit a tree or a window, or get lost out there in the wild yonder. Or worse of all, it might get eaten by a house cat. So we better keep that bird safe and sound inside a cage. Now, techniques vary greatly on how to clip a bird's wings. And as a mom, I'm a bit of a pro at the whole Scooby-Doo Band-Aid thing, but I am not a veterinarian. I'm not a veterinarian. So I'm trusting the breadth of information which can be found online about how to clip wings. Actually, I'm not going to give you a big lesson on wing clipping, but I do want to say that the primary difference in technique lay in the number of wings clipped and how much of the feather is left behind. The more feathers clipped, the greater the hindrance. So what I find compelling about this is that in clipping the bird's wings, in trying to keep the bird safe, we actually place the bird in greater harm. That bird wants to fly, and it's being forced to live differently than intended. So why all this talk of birds? The Holy Spirit, the one we envision as a dove, as God flying freely, soaring from above and beyond with grace and determination, with strength and freedom, that one, its wings have been clipped. The techniques we've employed were unintentional and mostly unseen. None of us ever wanted to clip the Spirit's wings, but we have. The irony of the whole thing is that we've clipped the Spirit's wings for the same reason that bird owners clip their birds' wings. We wanted to protect her. It's just she didn't need protecting. See, this Pentecost, I don't think it's my job to preach about Pentecost. I think it's my job to say, so when is the next Pentecost? Because is this all that the church could be? I don't think it is. I think we've been busy maintaining the institution of the church while our children and our grandchildren, and you know this to be true, I hear people tell me all the time, my grandchildren don't come to church and my children don't come to church. While they have been out there searching for God, we've said, come on in, instead of flying out there with the Spirit. So about now, you're thinking this is the most depressing Pentecost sermon ever. But there's really good news, to which we should respond, Of course, there's always good news. That is the hope of the gospel, the promise of resurrection, and the job of the advocate, i.e., winged bird, to bring good news of God's love and justice. So despite the fact that I've been talking about how very ordinary Pentecost is, there is one thing that did happen on that Pentecost that we remember so well that is completely unique. The people spoke, not just God. And the people burned, not just God. And the people flew from city to city, not just God. So here is the Pentecost question. When was the last time you talked about something and felt excited and breathless and confused? And I'm not talking about worn out and overworked. We've all felt that in and out of the church. I'm talking about knowing you're hooked to a dream and there's so much ahead of you that it scares the heck out of you, and that you can't wait to see what's going to happen next. Maybe it's been a little while, or maybe that's never ever happened to you. Well, there's this little fun fact. Did you know that birds, even if their wings have been clipped, can regain their flying abilities? If one thing is allowed to happen. If they are given the time and the space to regrow their feathers, then they can fly again. Couldn't the Holy Spirit grow her feathers back? Of course she could. Once we realize that we are the feathers of the Spirit, connected and joined to God. We are what needs to regrow. And there isn't a single solitary feather that isn't needed. Every single one of you is needed in this flight pattern. Because that's what's interesting about wing clipping. The bird still has a whole bunch of feathers. And when just a few are removed or cut, the entire flight is thrown off balance. Now I'm going to be honest with you. I don't always feel it or see it or even believe the Spirit is working. There are days and weeks and months where I question what God is doing, if anything. And then something will happen. And this week I had a glimpse of something. It's not much, but it's something. There is a new regional director here in East County. I don't know if you know that, but there is. And I invited him to have coffee with me. So I had my shtick about how I believe the best way of building a healthy community is for agencies and communities and schools and churches to work together instead of trying to fan the flames all by themselves. You guys have heard me give this. So he agreed with me. There's not a whole lot to not agree with. But as we sat there, he started expressing his dreams and saying things like, couldn't the faith community help us with this? And what if I, him, could get this representative to help us out? And do you think that you could find a few faith leaders or lay leaders and have a round table with me and we could start a plan? And maybe we could do some tutoring or some meals, or we could probably come up with transportation, and it was just a whole lot of dreaming. At some point, after about 2 hours of talking, it all got a bit jumbled up. But we broke the dream down, and we both left with a few little tasks. And I was excited, and I was hopeful, knowing that God was indeed working in the world, and working through what I thought, this is why the institutional church exists. And then reality set in. And I wasn't just excited, I was apprehensive. I would be walking into unfamiliar territory, and any part of that dream would be hard work. And I don't even know how to do that dream. And failure is possible when you start to work with a whole bunch of other people. So I thought about backing off, because I don't have to follow through with my parts. I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to working with any other organization besides the church. However, I also realize that I have been preaching this for years, and now I have someone who wants to help. Now I have an advocate. And I felt the wings of the dove stretch out a bit on that day. Anyway, it may sound like nothing much. Maybe not what we'd have in mind for a movement of the Spirit. And that may be true. Maybe a bit like showing up for a yearly festival that could hardly turn into much. But we just don't know. And that's how it is at Pentecost. We just never know. Nothing much could turn into everything. Because it's happened before. It happened in a manger, and it happened in bread and wine. And it happened on a cross, and it happened in wind and fire. And it's even happened with people's voices.